What if I told you that history's most famous genius was actually history's most spectacular failure? That the man who painted the Mona Lisa never delivered it to the client who paid for it? That Leonardo da Vinci spent 17 years building a horse statue that was eventually used for target practice by French soldiers? Tonight, we're going to explore the deliciously mundane truth about Leonardo da Vinci. Not the mythical Renaissance Superman you learned about in school, but the real man who spent more time staring at water flowing around rocks than actually finishing paintings. A man so chronically incapable of completing projects that his own contemporaries probably rolled their eyes whenever his name came up in conversation. This is the story of the most productively unproductive genius in human history, told at exactly the pace he lived it, slowly, methodically, and with absolutely no guarantee that anything will actually get finished by the end. So settle in for 2 hours of the most relaxingly disappointing biography you'll ever hear, because Leonardo da Vinci's greatest masterpiece might have been his ability to make extraordinary talent look utterly, gloriously ordinary. Welcome back to another wonderfully mundane journey through history. Tonight, we're going to meander through the remarkably ordinary life of someone you've probably heard mentioned once or twice. A fellow named Leonardo da Vinci. Yes, that Leonardo. But don't worry, we're not here to be dazzled by genius or overwhelmed by artistic brilliance. Instead, we'll explore the delightfully tedious reality of a man who spent most of his time obsessing over the angle of a bird's wing or the precise curve of flowing water. Before we begin this thoroughly unremarkable adventure, take a moment to get comfortable. Perhaps like this video if you're feeling generous. Subscribe to join our community of fellow insomniacs, and leave a comment telling us what time it is where you are and from which corner of the world you're listening. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, united in our quest for the most pedestrian possible retelling of history. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let's drift back to 15th century Italy, where the pace of life moved at roughly the speed of drying paint, which, coincidentally, Leonardo watched quite literally on many occasions. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of Tuscany in the year 1452. The landscape stretches endlessly, dotted with olive groves that shimmer silver green in the Mediterranean sun. The air carries the scent of wild thyme and the distant sound of church bells marking the hours with their monotonous, reassuring rhythm. In this thoroughly predictable corner of the world, in a village so small it barely deserves the name, a child was born who would spend his entire life being frustratingly curious about absolutely everything. Vinci, yes, that's where the Da Vinci comes from, meaning simply from Vinci, was the sort of place where nothing particularly interesting happened for decades at a time. The most exciting event might be the arrival of a traveling merchant with news from Florence, some 30 miles away. Imagine living in a world where 30 miles represented an almost unimaginable journey, where most people would live and die within walking distance of where they were born. Leonardo's father, Ser Piero, was a notary, essentially a professional bureaucrat who specialized in making legal documents as boring as humanly possible. Picture him. A man who spent his days hunched over parchment, carefully forming letters with a quill pen, documenting property transfers and marriage contracts with a kind of meticulous attention to detail that would make modern accountants weep with joy. The scratch of his pen on paper, the soft rustle of documents, the occasional clearing of his throat, these were the sounds that filled young Leonardo's earliest memories. His mother, Caterina, remains frustratingly mysterious to historians, which honestly makes perfect sense. In 15th century Italy, women of humble birth had a remarkable talent for disappearing from historical records, as if they existed in a parallel universe that chroniclers simply couldn't be bothered to document. What we do know is that she was likely a peasant woman, someone whose daily routine revolved around the thoroughly mundane tasks of survival, tending gardens, preparing meals, mending clothes, and watching the seasons change with the patience of someone who understood that life moved at its own unhurried pace. Leonardo was born illegitimate, which in those days was about as scandalous as having mismatched socks. Illegitimate children were everywhere, raised by extended families, apprenticed out early, and generally expected to make their own way in the world without much fuss. There's something almost refreshing about this practical approach. No hand-wringing or social stigma, just a collective shrug and a determination to get on with things. Imagine young Leonardo's days in Vinci, waking to the sound of roosters and church bells, the morning air cool and damp with dew. The village would slowly come to life with the kind of leisurely pace that modern people find almost incomprehensible. Bakers would begin their work before dawn, the smell of bread drifting through narrow streets. Farmers would head to their fields, moving with the unhurried gait of people who understood that rushing accomplished nothing. Children would play in the dust between houses, inventing games with sticks and stones, their laughter echoing off ancient walls that had witnessed generations of equally unremarkable childhoods. But Leonardo, even as a child, had this irritating habit of staring at things. Not in an intense, dramatic way. More like a cat watching a particularly uninteresting patch of sunlight. He would spend what must have been deeply annoying amounts of time examining the way water flowed around rocks in the stream, or how shadows fell differently as the sun moved across the sky. His relatives probably exchanged the kind of patient, long-suffering looks that adults reserve for children who ask too many questions about perfectly obvious things. When Leonardo was about 5 years old, his grandfather Antonio died, and this event gives us one of our most mundane glimpses into his early life. The old man's death was recorded in the family's tax records, because even in the 15th century, the government needed to know exactly how many people lived in each household for taxation purposes. Imagine the scene. Ser Piero, dutiful bureaucrat that he was, carefully updating the family's information, subtracting one person from the household roster with the same methodical precision he applied to all his paperwork. The boy was raised primarily by his father and stepmother, along with various other relatives who drifted in and out of the household with the casual informality of extended Italian families. Picture the dinner table conversations. Slow, meandering discussions about local affairs, the weather, the price of grain. Leonardo would have sat there, probably fidgeting, his mind already beginning to wander to more interesting questions about why food tasted the way it did or how the flame of the oil lamp managed to stay the same shape despite constantly moving. By the time Leonardo reached his early teens, it became clear that traditional education wasn't really taking hold. He showed little interest in Latin, the language of scholarship and law, which must have been deeply disappointing to his father. Instead, he seemed drawn to things you could touch, manipulate, observe directly. This practical orientation was both completely normal for a child of modest circumstances and utterly frustrating for a father who had hoped his son might follow in the family business of making legal documents as tedious as possible. And so, around 1467, when Leonardo was about 15, his father made a decision that would change everything, though it probably seemed like just another practical arrangement at the time. He would send the boy to Florence to apprentice with a master artist. Not because he recognized budding genius. That's far too romantic a notion. Rather, because apprenticeship was what you did with children who showed some manual dexterity but couldn't be trusted with important things like property law. The journey from Vinci to Florence would have taken the better part of a day, traveling along dusty roads that wound through hills covered in vineyards and olive groves. Picture Leonardo walking alongside a cart, his few possessions bundled in rough cloth, watching the countryside gradually give way to the suburbs of what was then one of the largest cities in Europe. The boy who had grown up in a village where everyone knew everyone else was about to enter a world of perhaps 100,000 souls, a number so vast it would have seemed almost incomprehensible. Florence in 1467 was a city of workshops, the air thick with the sounds and smells of constant production. Metalworkers hammered out tools and decorative objects, their rhythmic pounding creating a percussion section that never stopped. Leather workers tanned hides in solutions that produced odors ranging from merely unpleasant to absolutely revolting. Textile workers operated looms that clacked and rattled from dawn to dusk, producing the woolen cloth that was Florence's primary export. And scattered throughout this industrial symphony were the workshops of artists, quieter spaces where the main sounds were the scratch of drawing implements on paper and the soft conversations of masters explaining techniques to apprentices who were trying very hard to pay attention. Leonardo found himself in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, a man whose name translates to true eye. A wonderfully pretentious professional name for someone who spent his days teaching teenagers how to grind pigments and prepare wooden panels. Verrocchio's workshop was typical of its kind. A large, multi-purpose space filled with works in various stages of completion, apprentices of different ages and skill levels, and the accumulated detritus of years of artistic production. The workshop operated on a system that was both highly structured and completely informal. The youngest apprentices, boys like Leonardo, spent their first months doing the most tedious tasks imaginable. They swept floors, cleaned brushes, and prepared materials with the kind of repetitive precision that would drive modern teenagers to distraction within hours. Imagine spending your entire morning grinding minerals into powder, mixing them with oils and binders, testing the consistency again and again until it met the master's exacting standards. But there was something almost meditative about this work, a rhythm that allowed the mind to wander while the hands stayed busy. Leonardo would have spent hours grinding lapis lazuli into ultramarine blue, the most expensive pigment in the workshop. The stone had traveled thousands of miles from Afghanistan, passed through the hands of countless merchants, and now sat under his pestle being slowly reduced to powder. Each grain represented a small fortune, which meant that apprentices who spilled or wasted pigment faced consequences ranging from reduced meals to extended working hours. The daily routine in Verrocchio's workshop followed patterns that hadn't changed in generations. Work began at dawn, when natural light was soft and even. The first hour was spent preparing materials and organizing the day's tasks. Then came the long middle hours of actual work, painting, sculpting, drawing, when the light was strongest and most reliable. Late afternoon brought the tedious but essential tasks of cleaning up, storing materials properly, and preparing for the next day's work. Leonardo's fellow apprentices were a mixed bunch, boys from various backgrounds united primarily by their inability to succeed in more respectable professions. Some showed real talent and would eventually establish their own workshops. Others were clearly marking time until they could find something more suitable to their limited abilities. A few were there because their families had no idea what else to do with them, a category that probably included Leonardo himself. The apprentice system worked on principles of gradual advancement that required patience of almost superhuman proportions. New apprentices might spend months just watching and doing menial tasks before being allowed to touch actual artworks. Even then, their contributions were limited to the most basic elements, filling in backgrounds, painting drapery, or working on parts of compositions that were so unimportant that if they made mistakes, the damage could easily be corrected. But Leonardo, even in these early days, had this peculiar habit of studying everything with the intensity of someone preparing for an examination. While other apprentices grudgingly completed their assigned tasks and then relaxed, he would linger, examining how different pigments behaved when mixed, how various brushes created different textures, how the angle of light affected the appearance of colors and forms. This behavior was probably mildly annoying to his fellow apprentices, who had learned that the secret to surviving an apprenticeship was doing exactly what was required and no more. But Leonardo seemed genuinely fascinated by questions that struck others as pointless. Why did some colors fade more quickly than others? How did the wood grain of a panel affect the way paint appeared on its surface? What happened to the appearance of objects when viewed from unusual angles? Verrocchio, to his credit, recognized that he had acquired an apprentice who was both more curious and more observant than the average teenager. But even he probably couldn't have predicted where this curiosity would lead. In 1467, Leonardo da Vinci was just another illegitimate boy from a small village, learning a trade that might, with luck and skill, eventually provide him with a modest living. The fact that his notebooks would someday be studied by scholars, or that his paintings would hang in the world's great museums, would have seemed as unlikely as the possibility that humans might someday fly through the air in metal contraptions. And yet, even in these thoroughly ordinary beginnings, the patterns were already forming that would define Leonardo's entire approach to life. The endless curiosity, the careful observation, the refusal to accept simple explanations for complex phenomena. He was learning not just to make art, but to see the world as an endlessly fascinating collection of problems waiting to be solved. As our first segment draws to a close, imagine Leonardo at the end of his first year in Florence, exhausted from a long day in the workshop, lying on his simple bed in whatever modest lodging housed the apprentices. The city around him gradually quieting as darkness fell, the sounds of commerce and production giving way to the softer noises of evening. Distant conversations, the clip-clop of horses on stone streets, the occasional bark of a dog or cry of a night watchman. Tomorrow would bring another day of grinding pigments, cleaning brushes, and learning the countless small techniques that, accumulated over years, might eventually make him a competent craftsman. He had no way of knowing that his restless mind was already beginning to ask the questions that would occupy the rest of his remarkably unremarkable life. But that's a story for our next segment, when we'll explore how this perfectly ordinary apprentice began to develop the habits of mind that would make him, well, still perfectly ordinary, just in more interesting ways. Picture Florence in the early 1470s, a city where the rhythm of daily life moved like honey in winter. Slow, steady, and utterly predictable. The same apprentices walked the same streets to the same workshops every morning, their footsteps wearing grooves in stone that had been polished smooth by generations of similar journeys. Leonardo, now in his early 20s, had graduated from apprentice to, well, slightly less junior apprentice. Progress in the art world moved at roughly the speed of drying fresco, which is to say, you could watch it happen if you had absolutely nothing better to do with your time. By 1472, Leonardo had been accepted into the Guild of St. Luke, the Painters' Guild, which sounds far more impressive than it actually was. Imagine the ceremony. A handful of established artists gathered in a room that probably smelled of linseed oil and old wood, going through bureaucratic motions that had been repeated countless times before. Someone read from a ledger, Leonardo paid his dues, and suddenly he was officially qualified to accept commissions and train apprentices of his own. The whole affair probably took less time than a modern coffee break and was about as emotionally stirring as renewing a driver's license. But here's where Leonardo's story takes a turn that's both completely predictable and mildly interesting. While other newly minted masters were eagerly seeking commissions and establishing their own workshops, Leonardo seemed content to linger in Verrocchio's establishment, observing, experimenting, and generally behaving like someone who found the process more fascinating than the product. The Verrocchio workshop had become something of a local institution by this time. Clients knew they could commission a competent altarpiece or portrait and receive exactly what they expected. No unpleasant surprises, no revolutionary techniques, just solid, professional work delivered on time and within budget. It was the Renaissance equivalent of a reliable chain restaurant. You might not get the most exciting meal of your life, but you wouldn't be disappointed either. Leonardo fit into this environment like a square peg in a round hole that had been gradually worn down to accommodate square pegs. His fellow artists had learned to work around his peculiar habits. His tendency to stare at partially completed paintings for hours without touching them, his practice of making dozens of preparatory sketches for the simplest elements, his annoying insistence on understanding exactly why certain techniques worked rather than simply accepting that they did. Consider the famous Baptism of Christ, a perfectly conventional religious painting that Verrocchio's workshop produced around 1475. The commission was as standard as they come. John the Baptist pouring water over Christ's head while angels look on with appropriately reverent expressions. Any competent workshop could have completed such a piece in a few months, collected payment, and moved on to the next project. But Leonardo, assigned to paint one of the angels, approached this minor task with the kind of methodical obsession normally reserved for matters of life and death. He spent weeks studying how light fell on flowing hair, how skin looked when viewed through transparent fabric, how to suggest the weight and movement of drapery without making it look like carved wood. His fellow artists probably watched this elaborate preparation with the patient resignation of people waiting for a particularly slow-moving relative to finish getting ready for church. The angel he eventually produced was, well, it was definitely an angel. It looked appropriately angelic, with a kind of soft, luminous quality that suggested the artist had spent far too much time thinking about how celestial beings might actually appear to mortal eyes. Contemporary viewers probably glanced at it, nodded approvingly, and moved on to more important matters like whether their own souls were sufficiently prepared for the afterlife. But Leonardo's approach to the simple task revealed something that would characterize his entire career: an almost pathological inability to accept conventional solutions to artistic problems. Where other painters saw techniques that worked well enough, he saw questions that demanded investigation. How do you make paint look like living flesh? How do you suggest volume and weight in a medium that's essentially colored mud smeared on a flat surface? Why do some combinations of colors seem to vibrate while others lie flat and lifeless? These were not the kinds of questions that led to quick completion of commissions or satisfied clients who simply wanted their altarpieces delivered on time. They were the obsessions of someone who had somehow confused art-making with natural philosophy, treating his paintbrush like a scientific instrument and his canvas like a laboratory notebook. Around this time, Leonardo began keeping what we now call his notebooks, though notebook suggests a level of organization that would have been completely foreign to his actual practice. Imagine instead a collection of loose papers, bound volumes, and random scraps on which he recorded everything from grocery lists to architectural designs to anatomical observations to reminders about borrowing books from friends who were probably beginning to wonder if they'd ever see their property again. The notebooks reveal a mind that found everything interesting and nothing too trivial to record. On a single page, you might find a recipe for painting varnish, a sketch of a cat in various poses, calculations for the proportions of a building, and notes about the behavior of water flowing around obstacles. It was as if Leonardo had appointed himself the official recorder of everything that happened to catch his attention, which, inconveniently, was essentially everything. His handwriting, famously, ran from right to left, mirror writing that can only be read easily with a reflecting surface. Historians have proposed various explanations for this peculiar habit. Perhaps he was left-handed and found it easier. Perhaps he wanted to keep his notes private. Perhaps he was just being contrary. The truth is probably far more mundane. He likely developed the habit as a child and never bothered to change it, much the way some people never break the habit of biting their fingernails or talking to themselves. But imagine the daily reality of working alongside someone who wrote backwards and took notes about absolutely everything. Leonardo would be in the middle of mixing paints and suddenly stop to sketch the way dust motes moved in a shaft of sunlight. He'd interrupt conversations to examine how wrinkles formed in someone's sleeve, or to study the precise curve of a smile. His colleagues probably learned to allow extra time for any project that involved Leonardo, the way you might allow extra time when traveling with someone who stops to read every historical marker. In 1476, Leonardo's name appears in one of history's more tedious legal documents: an anonymous accusation of sodomy filed against him and several other young men. The case was eventually dropped, probably because there was no real evidence and because such accusations were so common in Florence that pursuing them all would have paralyzed the legal system. But the incident provides us with a wonderfully mundane glimpse into Leonardo's social life, or rather, his apparent lack of one. While other young artists were establishing themselves in Florence's social hierarchy, joining confraternities, making advantageous friendships, perhaps marrying and starting families, Leonardo seemed to exist slightly apart from these conventional patterns. He had friends and colleagues, but no record of romantic attachments or domestic arrangements. He was sociable but not social, if you catch the distinction. someone who could work companionably with others but who seemed to require unusual amounts of solitude for his endless observations and experiments. This social positioning, or lack thereof, actually served him quite well professionally. He was available for the kind of intensive, time-consuming projects that artists with families and social obligations might find difficult to accept. He could work irregular hours, travel when necessary, and pursue the lengthy experimental processes that increasingly characterized his approach to art-making. Around 1478, Leonardo received his first independent commission, an altarpiece for the chapel of San Bernardo in the Palazzo Vecchio. This was the kind of opportunity that ambitious young artists dreamed of: a prestigious location, important patrons, the chance to create something that would be seen by Florence's most influential citizens. Leonardo approached the project with his characteristic thoroughness, creating preliminary drawings, studying similar works by established masters, and generally preparing as if he were about to undertake the artistic equivalent of climbing Mount Everest. And then, he didn't finish it. The commission eventually went to another artist, Filippino Lippi, who completed a perfectly competent altarpiece that served the chapel adequately for centuries. Leonardo's preparatory work for the project survives in his notebooks. Dozens of sketches and studies that reveal an artist thinking through complex problems of composition, lighting, and narrative structure. But the actual painting, that remained forever incomplete, the first in what would become a long series of unfinished projects. This pattern of intense preparation followed by incomplete execution would define Leonardo's career in ways that probably frustrated his contemporaries beyond measure. Imagine commissioning an artist for an important project, watching him produce brilliant preliminary work that exceeded your expectations, and then waiting, and waiting, and waiting for the finished piece that never quite materialized. But from Leonardo's perspective, the preparatory work was often more interesting than the final execution. The problems of how to arrange figures in space, how to suggest complex emotions through gesture and expression, how to create the illusion of three-dimensional forms on a flat surface, these challenges engaged his curiosity in ways that the repetitive process of actually applying paint to panel apparently did not. During this period, Leonardo also began his famous anatomical studies, though famous might be overstating things since virtually nobody knew about them at the time. He had somehow gained access to human corpses, probably through connections with local hospitals or monasteries, and had begun the painstaking process of dissection and documentation that would occupy him intermittently for the rest of his life. Picture this scene: Leonardo in a cold, poorly lit room, working by candlelight or early morning sunshine, carefully opening human bodies to examine the structures hidden beneath the skin. The smell alone would have been enough to discourage most people, but Leonardo persisted with the same methodical patience he applied to everything else. He made hundreds of drawings documenting what he found: the branching patterns of blood vessels, the architecture of bones, the complex layering of muscles and tendons. This work was both groundbreaking and completely useless, at least in any practical sense. The anatomical knowledge Leonardo acquired through these dissections had no immediate application to his art. Renaissance painters had been successfully depicting human bodies for generations without needing to understand circulatory systems or muscle attachments. His discoveries wouldn't be published or shared with other scholars. They simply accumulated in his notebooks, alongside recipes and engineering sketches and observations about the flight patterns of birds. But Leonardo seemed genuinely fascinated by the sheer complexity of human bodies, the elegant solutions that nature had evolved for problems of structure, movement, and function. He approached corpses the way other people might approach particularly interesting machines, trying to understand how all the parts worked together to create something that could walk, breathe, think, and feel. Meanwhile, his actual artistic career continued its frustratingly irregular progress. He completed some works, abandoned others, and generally behaved like someone who had somehow confused art-making with pure research. Clients learned to expect delays, revisions, and possibly complete non-delivery. Other artists probably shook their heads and wondered how someone so obviously talented could be so professionally unreliable. The city of Florence during this period hummed along with the steady rhythm of commerce and craftsmanship that had made it one of Europe's most prosperous cities. Workshops produced their goods, merchants conducted their trades, and artists fulfilled their commissions with a dependable regularity that kept the economy functioning smoothly. And in the middle of all this productive activity, Leonardo continued his peculiar practice of treating every artistic problem as if it were a question that demanded investigation rather than a task that required completion. As the 1470s gave way to the 1480s, it became clear that Leonardo's approach to his profession was not going to change. He was what we might now recognize as someone constitutionally unsuited for conventional success, too curious for commercial efficiency, too interested in process to focus on products, too fascinated by questions to be satisfied with answers. But Florence was a large city with room for various types of artists, including those who marched to their own peculiar rhythms. Leonardo had established himself as someone capable of brilliant work when he chose to complete it, and there were always patrons willing to gamble on genius, even genius that came with no guarantee of delivery. The stage was now set for the next phase of Leonardo's career, when his reputation for both extraordinary talent and extraordinary unreliability would lead to an opportunity that would take him far from Florence and into the service of one of Italy's most powerful and demanding patrons. But that's a story that will have to wait for our next segment, where we'll follow Leonardo into a world of court politics, military engineering, and artistic projects on a scale that would challenge even his prodigious capacity for beginning things without finishing them. For now, imagine Leonardo as he existed in these early years of his independent career. A man approaching 30, recognized as exceptionally gifted but also exceptionally difficult to predict. He had found his own rhythm in a world that generally rewarded regularity, and somehow made it work well enough to keep himself fed, housed, and supplied with the materials necessary for his endless investigations into the nature of everything around him. In 1482, Leonardo made a decision that would have seemed perfectly reasonable to anyone familiar with his career pattern thus far. He abandoned Florence and its accumulating pile of unfinished commissions to seek his fortune elsewhere. The destination he chose was Milan, a city roughly 200 miles to the north that offered the irresistible combination of new opportunities and people who hadn't yet learned to expect artistic projects to remain forever incomplete. The journey from Florence to Milan would have taken about a week, following roads that wound through the Apennine Mountains and across the Po Valley. Picture Leonardo traveling with his small collection of possessions, notebooks, drawing materials, a few changes of clothing, and probably some unfinished paintings that he optimistically believed he might actually complete once he settled into his new circumstances. The landscape would have changed gradually from the rolling hills of Tuscany to the flatter, more agricultural terrain of Lombardy, where rice paddies reflected the sky like mirrors and the horizon seemed impossibly distant. Milan in the 1480s was ruled by Ludovico Sforza, known somewhat pretentiously as Il Moro, the Moor, though the nickname probably had more to do with his dark complexion than any exotic ancestry. Ludovico was the sort of Renaissance ruler who combined genuine cultural sophistication with the kind of political ruthlessness that made Game of Thrones look like a gentle family drama. He maintained power through a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and military threats, all while patronizing artists, scholars, and engineers with a lavish generosity of someone who understood that spectacular cultural achievements could be as politically useful as well-trained armies. Leonardo's approach to securing employment in Milan reveals both his characteristic confidence and his complete lack of conventional career planning. Instead of presenting himself as a painter seeking commissions, which would have been the obvious strategy given his reputation, he wrote a letter to Ludovico that reads like a resume composed by someone who had confused artistic training with military engineering expertise. The letter, which survives in Leonardo's notebooks, is a masterpiece of creative self-promotion. He claimed to possess knowledge of bridge construction, siege warfare, portable cannons, armored vehicles, and naval engineering. Almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that he could also paint and sculpt as well as any man. This was roughly equivalent to a modern graphic designer applying for a job by claiming expertise in rocket science, nuclear physics, and brain surgery, with a casual mention that they could also design websites if needed. Remarkably, this strategy worked. Ludovico hired Leonardo not primarily as an artist, but as a sort of general-purpose problem solver whose responsibilities would eventually include everything from designing costumes for court entertainments to planning irrigation systems to creating what may have been the Renaissance equivalent of a think tank devoted to impossible engineering projects. The Sforza court was a world unto itself, an elaborate theatrical performance that never ended. Imagine a community of several hundred people living in close proximity, all engaged in the complex social choreography that kept an absolute ruler happy and politically secure. Courtiers, servants, artists, scholars, diplomats, and hangers-on all moved through the same spaces according to protocols that had evolved over generations and were understood by everyone except newcomers who had to learn by observation and occasional embarrassing mistakes. Leonardo found himself assigned quarters somewhere in this vast human ecosystem, probably a modest room that served as both living space and workshop. The daily rhythm of court life would have been both more structured and more chaotic than anything he'd experienced in Florence. Meals were served at fixed times in the Great Hall, where seating arrangements reflected subtle hierarchies of favor and influence. Courtiers dressed according to elaborate codes that communicated their status, wealth, and current standing with the Duke. Entertainment was provided nightly: music, poetry recitations, philosophical debates, and theatrical performances that sometimes went on until dawn. But Leonardo, characteristically, seemed to exist somewhat apart from these social complexities. While other court members spent their time cultivating relationships and positioning themselves for advancement, he became absorbed in the technical challenges of his various assignments. When asked to design a monument to Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, he threw himself into the project with typical thoroughness, studying equestrian statues from antiquity, experimenting with bronze casting techniques, and creating preparatory models that impressed everyone who saw them. The monument project consumed years of Leonardo's time and became something of an obsession. He envisioned a bronze horse that would be larger than any similar work from antiquity, a technical challenge that required solving problems of metalworking, structural engineering, and artistic composition simultaneously. The preparatory work was extraordinary. Hundreds of drawings documenting horse anatomy, studies of movement and proportion, experiments with different poses and compositional arrangements. Picture Leonardo in his workshop, surrounded by clay models of horses in various stages of completion. The floor would have been covered with sketches and calculations, tools scattered among anatomical studies and engineering diagrams. The smell of clay, metal, and wood shavings would have mingled with the oil from lamps that burned late into the night as he worked through problems that seemed to grow more complex rather than simpler as he studied them more thoroughly. The full-scale clay model of the horse, when finally completed, stood nearly 24 feet high and was universally acknowledged as a masterpiece. Visitors to Milan made special trips to see it. Poets wrote verses celebrating its beauty, and other artists traveled hundreds of miles to study Leonardo's techniques. It was exactly the kind of spectacular cultural achievement that enhanced Ludovico's reputation and justified his investment in artistic patronage. And then, of course, it was never cast in bronze. The 75 tons of metal that had been allocated for the project were instead used to make cannons for Milan's defense against French invasion. The clay model remained in Leonardo's workshop, a monument to ambitious planning and the eternal gap between artistic vision and practical completion. French soldiers eventually used it for target practice when they captured Milan, destroying in a few hours what had taken years to create. But the horse project was only one of Leonardo's many responsibilities at the Sforza court. He also served as a sort of master of ceremonies for the elaborate entertainments that were essential to Renaissance court life. These were not simple parties, but complex theatrical productions that combined music, poetry, dance, and spectacular visual effects to create experiences that guests would remember and discuss for months afterward. Leonardo approached court entertainment with the same methodical creativity he applied to everything else. When asked to design costumes for a masquerade, he didn't simply create attractive clothing. He invented mechanisms that allowed dancers to transform their appearance during performances. Costumes that incorporated moving parts, lighting effects, and even primitive special effects that amazed audiences accustomed to the most sophisticated entertainments available. For one particularly elaborate production, he designed a mechanical paradise that opened to reveal actors dressed as planets and stars, complete with choreographed movements that demonstrated current theories about celestial mechanics. The audience watched what was essentially an educational astronomy lesson disguised as spectacular entertainment, though they probably focused more on the impressive visual effects than the scientific content. These projects required Leonardo to master crafts and techniques that had nothing to do with traditional artistic training. He learned stagecraft, mechanical engineering, costume construction, and what we might now call special effects design. Each new challenge sent him back to his notebooks, trying to understand the underlying principles that would allow him to create the effects he envisioned. Meanwhile, he continued his anatomical studies, though now with access to the resources of a major court. Ludovico apparently had no objection to his court artist dissecting corpses in the name of advancing human knowledge, and Leonardo took full advantage of this tolerance. He performed what may have been the first systematic study of human anatomy since ancient times, documenting everything from the structure of the heart to the development of unborn children. The anatomical work required a peculiar combination of scientific rigor and artistic sensitivity. Leonardo had to overcome not just the obvious physical challenges, the smell, the deterioration of specimens, the technical difficulty of preservation, but also the psychological barriers that prevented most people from examining human bodies with the detached curiosity necessary for systematic study. His anatomical drawings from this period are extraordinary documents that combine scientific accuracy with artistic beauty in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries. But they were also completely private achievements, known only to Leonardo himself and perhaps a few assistants who helped with the practical aspects of his research. The knowledge he gained had no immediate application to his other work and wouldn't be published or shared with the broader scholarly community. During his Milan years, Leonardo also began what would become his most famous painting, The Last Supper. The commission came from the monks of Santa Maria del Grazie, who wanted a scene of Christ's final meal with his disciples painted on the wall of their refectory. It was exactly the kind of conventional religious project that workshops throughout Italy completed regularly, though the monks probably expected something special given Leonardo's growing reputation. Leonardo approached The Last Supper with characteristic ambition, deciding to treat it not as a straightforward illustration of a biblical story, but as a complex psychological drama that would capture the precise moment when Christ announced that one of his disciples would betray him. This meant depicting 12 different emotional responses to devastating news, each character reacting according to his individual personality while contributing to the overall dramatic impact of the scene. The technical challenges alone were staggering. The painting was to cover an enormous wall, requiring techniques for maintaining consistent proportions and lighting across a surface much larger than anything Leonardo had previously attempted. The composition needed to accommodate 12 major figures plus Christ, all arranged in a way that would be visually coherent when viewed from the dining tables below. But Leonardo, predictably, made the project even more difficult by rejecting the traditional fresco technique that would have been the obvious choice for a wall painting. Fresco required working quickly while the plaster remained wet, applying paint in sections that had to be completed within a single day. This method was efficient and durable, but it didn't allow for the kind of detailed revision and experimentation that Leonardo's working process required. Instead, he developed an experimental technique that allowed him to work slowly, building up colors and effects over time like an oil painting. This approach gave him the flexibility he wanted but created durability problems that became apparent almost immediately. The paint began deteriorating while Leonardo was still working on the piece, and the deterioration continued steadily over the following decades. Picture Leonardo working on this massive project, standing on scaffolding in the monk's refectory, surrounded by the smells of cooking food and the sounds of daily monastic life. He would spend hours staring at sections of the painting, making tiny adjustments to expressions and gestures, then stepping back to consider the effect of these changes on the overall composition. The monks probably learned to work around his peculiar schedule, which involved long periods of apparent inactivity followed by intense bursts of painting that might continue well into the night. The psychological complexity Leonardo achieved in the Last Supper was unprecedented in religious art. Each apostle reacts to Christ's announcement with a distinct emotional response that reflects his individual character while contributing to the overall narrative structure. The painting functions simultaneously as a religious illustration, a study in group psychology, and a masterclass in compositional organization, though these achievements came at the cost of technical durability that made the work's long-term survival problematic. Throughout his Milan years, Leonardo maintained his practice of recording observations and ideas in his notebooks, which had grown into a sprawling collection of several thousand pages covering every subject that happened to catch his attention. The notebooks from this period reveal a mind that found everything interesting. The flight patterns of birds, the flow of water around obstacles, the mechanics of human movement, recipes for paint and varnish, philosophical speculations about the nature of vision, and detailed studies of plant growth. But they also reveal someone who was becoming increasingly isolated from the conventional art world of his time. While other artists were developing efficient workshop practices that allowed them to complete commissions reliably and train apprentices effectively, Leonardo was pursuing investigations that had no clear practical application and developing working methods that made collaboration extremely difficult. His few students during this period seem to have learned more about copying his techniques than understanding his approach to artistic problems. They could imitate his painting style with reasonable success, but they couldn't replicate his process of investigation and experimentation. Leonardo's methods were too personal, too dependent on his individual way of seeing and thinking, to be transmitted effectively to others. The political stability that had allowed Leonardo to pursue his various projects in Milan began to crumble in the 1490s as larger European powers became interested in Italian affairs. France had claims on the Duchy of Milan that Ludovico couldn't resolve through diplomacy or military deterrence. The complex web of alliances that had maintained the balance of power in northern Italy was beginning to unravel, and it became increasingly clear that major changes were inevitable. Leonardo probably watched these developments with the detached curiosity he applied to everything else, though he must have understood that his comfortable position at court depended entirely on Ludovico's continued political success. The life he had built in Milan, the resources for his experiments, the access to materials and specimens, the freedom to pursue whatever projects interested him. All of this would disappear if the political situation changed dramatically. In 1499, French armies finally invaded, Ludovico fled, and Leonardo found himself once again in need of new employment. He was now nearly 50 years old, with a reputation for extraordinary talent and equally extraordinary unreliability. His greatest works, The Clay Horse, The Last Supper, countless drawings and studies, were either destroyed, deteriorating, or hidden away in notebooks that few people had ever seen. But he had also spent 17 years developing approaches to art, science, and engineering that were unlike anything his contemporaries were doing. He had learned to see the world as an endlessly fascinating collection of problems waiting to be solved, and he had developed the patience necessary for investigations that might take years to complete and might never result in finished works that could be displayed or sold. As French soldiers took control of Milan and the Sforza court dissolved into memory, Leonardo packed his notebooks, gathered his few portable possessions, and prepared once again to reinvent himself in a new city with new patrons who hadn't yet learned that employing Leonardo da Vinci meant accepting artistic genius that came with absolutely no guarantee of conventional success. The next chapter of his story would take him back to Florence, then to Rome, and finally to France, always carrying with him the accumulated observations and unfinished projects that represented a lifetime of curiosity about absolutely everything. But for now, imagine him leaving Milan as he had arrived, traveling slowly along dusty roads, his mind already engaged with new questions about the landscape around him, completely unaware that history would remember his 17 years at the Sforza court as one of the most productive periods in the career of one of history's most remarkably unproductive geniuses. Leonardo's departure from Milan in 1499 marked the beginning of what we might generously call his wandering years, though wandering suggests a kind of romantic purposefulness that probably didn't characterize his actual experience. In reality, he was a man approaching 50 who had just lost his primary source of income and was faced with the decidedly unromantic necessity of finding new employment in a world that had grown somewhat skeptical of artists who specialized in beginning ambitious projects without finishing them. His first stop was Venice, a city that floated on its lagoon like a mirage made of marble and money. Venice in 1500 was perhaps the wealthiest city in Europe, its prosperity built on trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with Asia and Northern Europe. The city hummed with commercial activity conducted in a dozen languages, the sound of oars on water mixing with the calls of merchants hawking everything from silk and spices to manuscripts and mathematical instruments. But Venice, for all its wealth and sophistication, proved to be a poor match for Leonardo's particular talents. The Venetians were practical people who valued efficiency and reliability above artistic experimentation. When they commissioned art, they expected it to be completed on schedule and within budget. When they hired engineers, they wanted immediate solutions to specific problems, not lengthy investigations into theoretical principles. Leonardo spent a few months in Venice working on fortification designs to defend the city against Turkish invasion, a real and pressing concern that required practical solutions rather than innovative approaches. His proposals were typically ambitious and completely impractical. Flooding systems that would require massive construction projects, mechanical devices that existed mainly in his imagination, defensive strategies that assumed unlimited budgets and infinite time for implementation. The Venetian authorities examined his plans with the patient attention of people accustomed to evaluating expensive proposals, thanked him politely, and probably filed his drawings away in whatever Renaissance equivalent existed for bureaucratic archives where impractical ideas went to die quietly. Leonardo, recognizing that Venice was not going to provide the kind of long-term employment he needed, packed his notebooks once again and headed south toward more familiar territory. Florence in 1500 welcomed him back like a favorite relative who had proven too eccentric for polite society but was still family. The city had changed during his 18-year absence. New buildings, different political arrangements, a generation of artists who had grown up hearing stories about the brilliant but unreliable Leonardo da Vinci who had abandoned Florence to seek his fortune elsewhere. But the essential rhythm of the city remained the same. Workshops producing their goods, merchants conducting their business, and artists competing for commissions with a mixture of talent and self-promotion that had characterized Florentine cultural life for generations. Leonardo found lodging and workshop space, renewed old friendships, and gradually began to establish himself once again in the city's artistic community. But he was no longer the promising young artist who had left for Milan decades earlier. He was now middle-aged, with a reputation that preceded him like a warning label. Extraordinary talent, unreliable delivery, tendency to abandon projects when they ceased to interest him. Despite these professional limitations, Leonardo received what would become perhaps his most famous commission: a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, wife of a wealthy Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. The Mona Lisa began as a completely conventional portrait commission, the kind of project that competent artists completed regularly as a reliable source of income. A merchant wanted a formal portrait of his wife to display in their home, probably to commemorate a significant occasion like an anniversary or the birth of a child. Leonardo approached this straightforward commission with his characteristic inability to accept simple solutions to artistic problems. Instead of creating a standard portrait that would satisfy his client quickly and efficiently, he became fascinated by technical challenges that existed mainly in his own mind. How do you suggest the internal emotional state of a person through subtle variations in facial expression? How do you create the illusion of living, breathing flesh using nothing but pigments mixed with oil? How do you paint air itself, the atmospheric perspective that makes distant objects appear softer and bluer than those in the foreground? Picture Leonardo working on this portrait in his Florence workshop, the familiar sounds of the city filtering through windows that looked out onto streets he had walked as a young apprentice decades earlier. The painting evolved slowly, session by session, as Leonardo experimented with glazing techniques that built up layers of transparent color to create effects of depth and luminosity that had never been achieved in portraiture. But what should have been a relatively quick commission stretched on for months, then years. Francesco del Giocondo probably made polite inquiries about progress, received reassurances that the work was progressing beautifully, and gradually came to understand that he had hired an artist who was more interested in solving technical problems than delivering finished products. The portrait that was supposed to hang in the Giocondo family home instead remained in Leonardo's workshop, accumulating layers of paint and becoming an obsession that would occupy him for the rest of his life. During these Florence years, Leonardo also received a commission that seemed perfectly suited to his interests and abilities: a large wall painting for the Palazzo Vecchio depicting a historical battle scene. The project would have allowed him to combine his interests in human anatomy, mechanical engineering, and dramatic storytelling in a work that would be seen by the most important citizens of Florence. It was exactly the kind of prestigious public commission that established artistic reputations and provided financial security. Leonardo threw himself into the preparatory work with typical enthusiasm, creating hundreds of sketches documenting everything from horse anatomy to the mechanics of combat to the design of period costumes and weapons. He studied historical accounts of the battle, visited the actual battlefield to understand the terrain, and developed innovative techniques for transferring his design to the vast wall surface that would accommodate the finished work. But when the time came for actual execution, Leonardo once again encountered the gap between ambitious planning and practical completion. The experimental painting technique he had developed for the project, a variation on encaustic painting that he believed would be more durable than traditional fresco, simply didn't work as he had hoped. The paint refused to adhere properly to the wall, colors ran together in uncontrolled ways, and sections of the work began deteriorating almost immediately. After months of struggle with technical problems that seemed to multiply rather than resolve themselves, Leonardo abandoned the project. The wall was eventually painted by other artists who used conventional techniques to create a perfectly adequate battle scene that served the Palazzo Vecchio for centuries. Leonardo's preparatory work, some of the most dynamic drawings of his entire career, survived in his notebooks as evidence of what might have been achieved if artistic vision had been matched by practical execution. These frustrating experiences in Florence gradually convinced Leonardo that his future lay elsewhere. He was now in his 50s, with a string of unfinished projects behind him and diminishing prospects for the kind of patronage that would allow him to pursue his investigations without the pressures of commercial deadlines. When Cesare Borgia offered him employment as a military engineer, Leonardo accepted with what was probably considerable relief. Working for Cesare Borgia was like joining a traveling circus devoted to political violence and territorial conquest. Borgia was attempting to create a personal kingdom in central Italy through a combination of military force, political manipulation, and strategic terror that made Game of Thrones look like a documentary about conflict resolution. Leonardo's role was to provide technical expertise for siege warfare, fortification design, and the various engineering challenges involved in maintaining armies in the field. Picture Leonardo traveling through the Italian countryside with Borgia's forces, his notebooks now filled with observations about military engineering alongside his usual collection of anatomical studies, mechanical designs, and random observations about natural phenomena. The contrast between his scholarly interests and his employer's methods must have been stark. Leonardo studying the flight patterns of birds while Borgia's soldiers besieged cities and negotiated surrenders through displays of overwhelming force. But the employment provided Leonardo with opportunities for travel and observation that he wouldn't have had otherwise. He visited cities throughout central Italy, studied different approaches to fortification and urban planning, and gained practical experience with engineering problems that existed outside the theoretical realm of his notebooks. The work also provided steady income and the kind of employment flexibility that allowed him to continue his personal investigations alongside his professional responsibilities. When Borgia's political fortunes collapsed, as they inevitably did, given the ambitious scope of his plans and the limited sustainability of his methods, Leonardo found himself once again in need of employment. He was now approaching 60, an age when most people of his era were either dead or settled into whatever circumstances had characterized their mature years. But Leonardo's career had never followed conventional patterns, and his later years would prove to be as unpredictable as everything that had come before. He spent brief periods in various Italian cities, accepting short-term commissions, continuing his anatomical studies, and filling more notebooks with observations that would never be organized into publishable form. His reputation had evolved into something that was both an asset and a liability. Everyone knew that Leonardo da Vinci was capable of extraordinary work, but everyone also knew that employing him meant accepting artistic genius that came with no guarantee of practical results. In 1516, when Leonardo was 64 years old, he received an invitation that would determine how he spent his final years. Francis I, the young king of France, offered him a position that was essentially a royal pension in exchange for the honor of having the famous Leonardo da Vinci as a member of his court. The arrangement came with few specific responsibilities, generous compensation, and a house in the Loire Valley where Leonardo could pursue whatever projects interested him. The journey from Italy to France would have been the longest trip of Leonardo's life, covering hundreds of miles through alpine passes that challenged travelers even in good weather. Picture him at 64, no longer young but still intensely curious, traveling slowly along roads that would have been rough even by Renaissance standards. His few possessions including several paintings, probably including the Mona Lisa, and the accumulated notebooks of a lifetime spent observing everything that happened to catch his attention. The house that Francis provided, the Château du Clos-Luz, was comfortable by any reasonable standard, though modest compared to the palaces where Leonardo had worked during his years at the Sforza court. It came with a small household staff, adequate workshop space, and the kind of quiet retirement environment that might have seemed ideal for someone approaching the end of a long and productive career. But Leonardo, even at 64, remained constitutionally incapable of conventional retirement. He continued his anatomical studies, worked sporadically on his paintings, and filled more notebook pages with observations about hydraulic engineering, mechanical devices, and natural phenomena. The young French king would visit occasionally, more interested in the honor of patronizing a famous Italian genius than in any practical results from Leonardo's investigations. These final years in France were probably the most peaceful period of Leonardo's adult life. He was freed from the pressures of seeking commissions, completing projects on schedule, or justifying his experimental approaches to skeptical clients. He could work at whatever pace suited him, pursue whatever questions interested him, and generally behave like someone whose primary responsibility was to his own curiosity rather than to external expectations. But this freedom also highlighted the essential tragedy of Leonardo's career: his inability to transform brilliant investigations into completed works that could be shared with others. His notebooks contain discoveries about anatomy, engineering, and natural philosophy that wouldn't be rediscovered by others for centuries. His artistic techniques represented innovations that could have revolutionized Renaissance painting if he had been able to teach them systematically to students or document them in treatises that other artists could study. Instead, most of his knowledge remained locked away in notebooks written in mirror script and organized according to principles that made sense only to Leonardo himself. The few students who worked with him during his final years learned to copy his painting techniques with reasonable competence, but they couldn't replicate his process of investigation or continue his lines of research after his death. Leonardo's health began to decline in his late 60s, though he remained mentally active almost until the end. Contemporary accounts describe him as still capable of long conversations about art, science, and philosophy, still interested in mechanical problems and natural phenomena, but increasingly frail and dependent on others for physical assistance. His right hand had become partially paralyzed, probably from a stroke, though he could still draw and write with his left hand. On May 2, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died at the Château du Clos-Luz, probably from what we would now recognize as complications from a series of strokes. He was 67 years old, which was a respectable age for someone of his era, though not exceptional. The King of France may or may not have been present at his deathbed. The romantic accounts that describe Francis holding Leonardo as he died were probably invented by later writers who understood that dramatic endings make better stories than mundane deaths from age-related illness. What Leonardo left behind was both extraordinary and frustratingly incomplete. A few dozen paintings, some finished and others abandoned in various states. Several thousand pages of notebooks filled with observations, sketches, and ideas that represented one of the most remarkable records of individual curiosity in human history, and a reputation for genius that was matched by an equally strong reputation for the kind of professional unreliability that made him fascinating to study but impossible to employ. His immediate influence on Renaissance art was probably less significant than his long-term reputation would suggest. The techniques he developed were too personal and too experimental to be easily transmitted to students. His approaches to artistic problems were too time-consuming for artists who needed to complete commissions reliably. His investigations into anatomy, engineering, and natural philosophy remained mostly private obsessions that had little impact on the broader intellectual developments of his time. But Leonardo had accomplished something that was perhaps more remarkable than conventional artistic success. He had maintained his curiosity about absolutely everything for an entire lifetime. In a world that generally rewarded specialization and efficiency, he had insisted on treating every question as worthy of investigation, every problem as an opportunity for learning, every project as a chance to understand something new about how the world worked. As our long journey through Leonardo's remarkably unremarkable life draws to a close, imagine him in his final months at the Château du Clos-Luz, still filling notebook pages with observations about the behavior of water in fountains, the flight patterns of birds outside his windows, the way light fell across the surfaces of objects in his workshop. His body was failing, but his mind remained engaged with the same questions that had fascinated him as a young apprentice in Florence decades earlier. He died as he had lived, curious about everything, satisfied with very little, leaving behind a collection of unfinished projects and unanswered questions that would puzzle and inspire people for centuries to come. In the end, perhaps that was enough. Not the conventional success that his contemporaries understood and valued, but the deeper satisfaction of having spent a lifetime paying attention to the endless complexity and beauty of the world around him. And with that thought, as we reach the end of our exploration of Leonardo da Vinci's thoroughly ordinary life, you might find yourself ready for the kind of peaceful sleep that eluded him throughout his restless, questioning, endlessly fascinating existence. Tomorrow will bring its own observations and investigations, but for now, rest comes easily to those who understand that some questions are more interesting than their answers, and that curiosity itself might be the most remarkable human achievement of all. And so we come to the end of our leisurely stroll through the life of Leonardo da Vinci, that most famously unproductive of productive geniuses. We've spent these past 2 hours wandering through his world at roughly the same pace he moved through it. Slowly, observantly, with frequent pauses to examine details that others might have overlooked entirely. What strikes me most about Leonardo's story is not the dramatic moments that biographers usually emphasize, but the quiet persistence of his curiosity. For 67 years, he woke each morning in a world full of questions that seemed to demand his attention. The way water moved around stones in a stream, the precise mechanism by which human eyes focused on distant objects, the engineering principles that allowed birds to remain airborne. These weren't grand philosophical mysteries to Leonardo, but simply interesting problems that happened to present themselves during the course of ordinary days. Think about that for a moment. In our modern world of instant answers and Googled solutions, we've perhaps lost touch with the peculiar pleasure of living comfortably with unanswered questions. Leonardo spent decades wondering about things that we could now look up in minutes, but he seemed to find genuine satisfaction in the wondering itself. His notebooks are filled not just with conclusions, but with the process of thinking through problems that had no urgent practical application. There's something deeply restful about this approach to existence. Leonardo wasn't racing toward achievements or anxiously measuring his progress against his contemporaries' successes. He was simply paying attention, day after day, year after year, to whatever happened to catch his interest. His career failures, the unfinished commissions, the experimental techniques that didn't work, the grand projects that remained forever incomplete, weren't sources of shame but natural byproducts of a life devoted to investigation rather than production. Imagine what it would be like to move through your own days with even a fraction of Leonardo's patience for observation. To notice the way morning light falls differently across familiar surfaces as the seasons change. To wonder without urgency about the mechanics of everyday phenomena that we usually take for granted. To find genuine fascination in problems that have no obvious solutions or immediate applications. This isn't to suggest that we should all abandon practical considerations and become Renaissance-style dilettantes. Most of us have responsibilities that require completion rather than endless investigation. But there's something to be learned from Leonardo's example about the value of maintaining curiosity as an end in itself, rather than merely as a means to achieve specific goals. His notebooks, scattered across museums and private collections, remain monuments to this approach. Page after page of observations, sketches, questions, and partial answers that were never intended for publication or practical application. They were simply records of a mind that found the world endlessly interesting and wanted to understand it better, one small investigation at a time. As you settle into sleep tonight, you're engaging in one of the few activities that Leonardo probably never studied systematically, though he certainly experienced it daily for 67 years. Sleep remains one of humanity's most necessary and least understood phenomena, a nightly surrender to unconsciousness that somehow restores our capacity for consciousness. Leonardo, with his passion for understanding biological processes, would probably have found sleep fascinating if he had possessed the tools to investigate it properly. But perhaps it's fitting that sleep remained outside his extensive catalog of investigations. Some mysteries are better experienced than explained, better surrendered to than solved. The transition from waking consciousness to peaceful sleep doesn't require understanding. Only acceptance, relaxation, and the kind of trust that allows the mind to release its grip on the day's questions and concerns. In this sense, sleep might be the perfect counterbalance to Leonardo's relentless curiosity. Where he spent his waking hours actively engaging with problems and phenomena, sleep offers the opposite: passive restoration, unconscious processing, and the kind of mental renewal that happens when we stop trying to understand everything around us and simply allow ourselves to exist without effort or intention. Your bedroom tonight, with its familiar sounds and shadows, its comfortable temperature and supportive surfaces, represents a level of physical security and comfort that Leonardo could hardly have imagined. The simple act of lying down in a warm, safe space with confidence that you'll wake refreshed in the morning is a luxury that previous centuries would have considered almost miraculous. Leonardo spent his nights in rooms lit by candles or oil lamps, vulnerable to fires, thieves, disease, and the countless other hazards that made sleep in the Renaissance a considerably more precarious proposition than it is for us. Yet even in his uncertain world, he must have found the same daily relief in surrendering consciousness, the same restoration that sleep provides regardless of historical circumstances or technological conveniences. As your breathing deepens and your thoughts begin to drift away from the specific details of Leonardo's story, you might carry with you not the facts and dates we've covered, but something more fundamental. The image of a person who remained genuinely curious about absolutely everything for an entire lifetime. Someone who found sufficient satisfaction in questions themselves that he never felt compelled to rush toward answers. This is perhaps Leonardo's most practical legacy. Not his artistic techniques or scientific discoveries, but his demonstration that curiosity can be its own reward, that investigation can be more fulfilling than conclusion, that a life spent paying attention to the world's complexity is a life well lived, regardless of how many projects remain unfinished at the end. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow's questions will still be there when you wake, and that there's no urgency to solve them all at once. Leonardo never did, and history seems to have forgiven him for it. In fact, it's precisely his unfinished investigations that make him interesting centuries later. Proof that some achievements are measured not by completion, but by the depth and persistence of attention we bring to the endless mystery of being alive in a world full of things worth wondering about. The last sound Leonardo heard may have been the gentle movement of air through the windows of his room in France, carrying with it the scents and sounds of a world that had occupied his attention for 67 years. Tonight, as you drift toward your own peaceful sleep, listen for whatever quiet sounds surround you. The distant hum of traffic, the settling of your house, the barely perceptible rhythm of your own breathing. These ordinary phenomena would have fascinated Leonardo completely, and perhaps they can bring you the same sense of connection to the subtle, constant miracle of simply being here, simply being aware, simply allowing yourself to rest in the presence of mysteries that don't require solving. Good night, and sleep well in the comfort of unfinished things.